At first, it doesn't look like a collapse. There is no explosion, no sirens echoing across the skyline, no single moment where America officially declares an emergency. Instead, it begins quietly, almost politely, with satellite images that few people notice and water gauges that drop by inches no one feels. Barges slow down, riverbanks widen, mud cracks where water once moved with unstoppable force. The Mississippi River, America's most powerful artery, begins to disappear, not all at once, but enough to make experts uneasy, enough to make historians nervous, enough to remind anyone paying attention that civilizations rarely fall in a day. They dry up first. For thousands of years, the Mississippi River has not merely flowed through America, it has built it. Before the United States existed, before borders, before cities, this river shaped ecosystems, trade routes, and human survival. Indigenous civilizations rose along its banks, understanding something modern America would later forget: when the river changes, everything changes. The Mississippi is not just water, it is movement, it is connection. It is food, fuel, industry, and identity flowing together as one system. And now, that system is under strain. By the early 21st century, warning signs were already visible. Rainfall patterns across North America had begun to shift. Snowpack in the Rockies, which feeds the river system slowly and steadily, started to decline. Summers grew longer, hotter, more aggressive. Droughts that once arrived once a generation began appearing every few years. Yet America, confident in its engineering and infrastructure, treated the river as something permanent, something controllable. Levees were reinforced, channels were dredged. The assumption remained unchanged: the river would always be there. But rivers do not obey assumptions. They obey physics. As temperatures rise, evaporation accelerates. Water that once lingered now escapes into the atmosphere faster than it can be replaced. When rainfall becomes irregular, violent storms followed by long dry stretches, the land absorbs less water, sending floods briefly and drought permanently. The Mississippi's vast basin, stretching across 31 states, begins to feel the imbalance. Tributaries weaken, feeder rivers shrink. What once arrived steadily now arrives sporadically, unpredictably, and slowly the river's baseline level drops. At first, the impacts are subtle. Cargo companies reroute shipments, barges reduce loads to avoid grounding, insurance rates quietly rise. Farmers downstream notice saltwater creeping further inland as reduced freshwater flow allows the Gulf of Mexico to push backward. Coastal wetlands begin to die, removing a natural buffer that once protected cities from storms. Each problem seems isolated, manageable. No single headline screams collapse. Yet beneath the surface, the system is unraveling. Because the Mississippi River is not simply a river, it is the backbone of American logistics. Nearly 60% of U.S. grain exports rely on this waterway. Corn, soybeans, wheat, harvested in the heartland travel south through the Mississippi to reach global markets. When water levels drop, shipping slows. When shipping slows, costs rise. When costs rise, food prices follow. The connection between a cracked riverbed in Missouri and a grocery store in New York is invisible, but absolute. And once that connection weakens, inflation is no longer theoretical, it becomes personal. Industries along the river begin to feel it next. Power plants that rely on river water for cooling struggle to operate at capacity. Chemical facilities face supply disruptions. Refineries encounter transport bottlenecks. America's industrial efficiency, built on cheap water transport, loses one of its greatest advantages. Rail and trucking attempt to compensate, but they are slower, more expensive, and already stretched thin. The river once moved what highways never could. Without it, the math stops working. Cities feel the change in quieter ways. Municipal water systems designed for stable river levels face intake issues. Treatment plants operate closer to failure thresholds. In some regions, water restrictions quietly return, framed as conservation rather than crisis. But the psychological shift has begun. Americans, long accustomed to abundance, are asked, softly at first, to use less, to trust that this is temporary, to believe the river will come back. History suggests otherwise. Civilizations that lose control of water rarely recover quickly. Ancient Mesopotamia collapsed as irrigation salinized its fields. The Maya faced societal breakdown during prolonged droughts. Even the Roman Empire struggled when climate shifts disrupted agriculture and trade. In every case, the story is the same. Water scarcity exposes weaknesses that already exist. Political division intensifies. Economic inequality widens. Infrastructure fails unevenly, favoring the powerful while abandoning the vulnerable. In the United States, those fault lines are already present. Rural communities dependent on agriculture feel pressure first. Crop yields fluctuate. Debt increases. Family farms, already operating on thin margins, face impossible decisions. Sell land, take loans, or hope next season brings rain. Urban centers feel delayed effects, but sharper consequences. Rising food prices, utility costs, and economic uncertainty. The river's decline does not strike everyone equally. It never does. Meanwhile, the Mississippi Delta continues to erode. Without strong river flow to replenish sediment, Louisiana loses land at an alarming rate. Wetlands vanish, storm surges push further inland, cities like New Orleans become increasingly exposed, protected by infrastructure built for a river that no longer behaves as expected. Engineers can reinforce walls, but they cannot force water to appear. The river's retreat leaves behind vulnerability that concrete alone cannot solve. By now, scientists speak openly of systemic risk. Hydrologists warn that what's happening is not a temporary drought, but a long-term shift. Climate models suggest increased volatility, longer dry periods punctuated by extreme floods. The river no longer follows the patterns it once did. Predictability, the foundation of planning, begins to disappear. And when systems cannot be predicted, they cannot be trusted. Trust erodes quickly. Federal agencies issue reports. State governments argue over water rights. Upstream usage becomes a political weapon. Who deserves the water when there isn't enough? Agriculture, industry, cities, ecosystems? The Mississippi was once abundant enough to avoid these questions. Now, scarcity forces choices, and choices create conflict. Legal battles begin quietly, buried in courts and committees, but their implications are enormous. Public attention flickers, then fades. Other crises compete for headlines. The river's decline is slow enough to be ignored, yet fast enough to matter. This is the most dangerous speed of collapse, too gradual for panic, too severe for denial. And beneath it all lies a deeper truth America has not fully confronted. Modern society is far less resilient than it appears. The Mississippi River helped unify the United States economically. It allowed inland states to matter. It connected farms to ports, workers to markets, regions to each other. As it weakens, that unity frays. Supply chains stretch, regional disparities widen. The idea that everything is connected begins to feel less comforting and more threatening. And still, most people believe recovery is inevitable, that rain will return, that technology will intervene, that America has faced challenges before and always adapted. But adaptation requires time, coordination, and honesty. And time is precisely what a drying river does not offer. Because water systems operate on thresholds, there comes a point where gradual decline becomes sudden failure, where saltwater intrusion contaminates freshwater beyond repair, where navigation becomes impossible, not inconvenient, where ecosystems collapse faster than restoration can keep up. The Mississippi has not reached that point yet, but it is moving towards it. Silently, relentlessly. Standing on the cracked riverbed, it's difficult to imagine the scale of what's unfolding. The absence of water feels local, almost trivial. But zoom out, and the picture becomes clear. This is not about a river drying up. This is about an economic engine stalling, a food system destabilizing, a nation discovering that even its most ancient foundations are not guaranteed. The Mississippi River is sending a message, not of immediate destruction, but of approaching consequence. The question is not whether America will respond. The question is whether it will respond before the damage becomes irreversible. Because once a river like this truly collapses, it doesn't just take water with it. It takes everything built upon its flow.
The moment the Mississippi River stops behaving like a river, America's systems begin to behave like something far more fragile. What was once dismissed as a seasonal anomaly now becomes a pattern, and patterns change behavior. Shipping companies no longer plan months ahead, they plan weeks ahead, sometimes days. Barges sit idle, their hulls resting on exposed sandbars that were never meant to see sunlight. Each grounded vessel represents more than delayed cargo. It represents a chain reaction rippling through the national economy. When the river slows, America slows with it. Grain terminals along the river begin operating below capacity. Elevators fill faster than they can empty. Farmers who timed harvests around predictable river schedules are forced to store crops longer, increasing spoilage risk and insurance costs. Some attempt to reroute shipments by rail, but rail networks were never designed to absorb the full weight of river commerce. Prices climb, not dramatically at first, just enough to be noticed by analysts, not yet by households. But markets are forward-looking, and the signal is clear. The Mississippi is no longer reliable. Global buyers take note. Countries that once depended on American grain begin diversifying suppliers. South America, Eastern Europe, and Asia move quickly, locking in contracts that once belonged to the United States. This shift is subtle but strategic. Trade relationships, once lost, are difficult to reclaim. America's reputation as a stable exporter weakens, not because of politics or war, but because its most fundamental resource is faltering. Water scarcity, once viewed as a developing world problem, is now attached to the world's largest economy. Inside the United States, the effects move unevenly but relentlessly. Food processors face higher input costs. Meat prices rise as feed becomes more expensive. Supermarket shelves remain full, but prices tell a different story. Inflation is no longer driven solely by energy or housing. It now has a hydrological component. Few consumers connect their grocery bill to a river hundreds of miles away, but the connection exists whether it's understood or not. Energy systems feel the pressure next. Power plants along the Mississippi rely on river water for cooling. As levels drop and temperatures rise, efficiency declines. Some facilities reduce output during peak heat waves, the very moments electricity demand spikes. Grid operators issue conservation requests, carefully worded to avoid panic. Rolling outages remain rare, but the margin of safety narrows. Infrastructure built for 20th century conditions struggles to adapt to 21st century extremes. Municipal governments begin confronting difficult truths. Water treatment plants face intake challenges as river levels fall below design thresholds. Dredging becomes more frequent and more expensive. Taxpayers absorb the cost, often without understanding why. In some cities, officials quietly explore alternative water sources: groundwater extraction, interbasin transfers, emergency reservoirs. Each solution carries trade-offs, environmental risks, and political consequences. Water, once taken for granted, becomes a subject of negotiation. Negotiation eventually turns into dispute. Upstream states, facing their own shortages, resist calls to release more water downstream. Agriculture, industry, and urban centers all claim necessity. Federal mediation attempts to balance competing demands, but water law was never designed for prolonged scarcity at this scale. The Mississippi Basin was built on abundance. Scarcity exposes legal gray zones, outdated compacts, and assumptions that no longer hold. Lawsuits begin stacking up, slow-moving but profound in implication. Meanwhile, the ecological consequences accelerate. Reduced flow allows salt water from the Gulf of Mexico to push further inland, contaminating freshwater ecosystems and threatening drinking water supplies. Wetlands that once acted as natural filters and buffers disappear, replaced by open water or barren land. Fish populations decline. Biodiversity loss, often invisible to urban populations, signals deeper instability. Ecosystems are early warning systems, and they are flashing red. In Louisiana, the situation becomes impossible to ignore. Coastal erosion accelerates as sediment delivery from the river diminishes. Land loss, already severe, reaches new levels. Communities that have existed for generations confront the reality that their geography is dissolving beneath them. Relocation discussions, once hypothetical, become urgent. The cost of defending every mile of coastline proves unsustainable. Retreat, a word politicians avoid, enters the conversation. National media begins paying attention, not because the river is gone, but because the consequences are spreading. Headlines shift from drought coverage to supply chain analysis. Economists debate whether this is a temporary shock or a structural transformation. Climate scientists emphasize that this pattern aligns with long-term projections. The Mississippi is not failing alone. It is part of a broader reconfiguration of North American climate systems. Public trust wavers. Americans are accustomed to crises that arrive suddenly: financial crashes, hurricanes, terrorist attacks. This crisis is different. It unfolds slowly, persistently, without a clear endpoint. There is no single villain, no obvious fix. Adaptation requires coordination across states, industries, and political ideologies that rarely agree on anything. As frustration grows, so does polarization. Water management becomes politicized. Scientific warnings are challenged. Short-term economic interests clash with long-term survival strategies. Rural-urban divides deepen. Farmers feel targeted by conservation mandates they believe threaten their livelihoods. Cities accuse rural regions of wasteful practices. States accuse each other of hoarding resources. The river that once united the country now becomes a source of division. Infrastructure decisions, from dam releases to dredging priorities, carry political weight. Every choice benefits someone and disadvantages someone else. And then come the extremes. As drought lowers baseline levels, storms grow more violent. When rain does arrive, it comes in torrents, overwhelming dry soil and sending destructive floods downstream. Levees designed for historical patterns face stress from both extremes: too little water and too much. Repairs grow more frequent, more expensive, more desperate. Insurance markets respond by raising premiums or withdrawing coverage entirely from high-risk zones. Homeowners find themselves trapped between uninsurable properties and declining land values. The psychological impact spreads. Confidence in permanence erodes. Businesses delay investments along the river corridor. Young families reconsider settling in vulnerable regions. Migration patterns begin to shift, not dramatically, but measurably. People move away from uncertainty. They always have. Over time, these small decisions reshape demographics, labor markets, and political power. Federal response ramps up, but coordination lags behind reality. Emergency funding flows after disasters, not before. Infrastructure bills promise resilience, but projects take years while conditions worsen annually. Technology offers partial relief: better forecasting, more efficient irrigation, adaptive engineering. But technology cannot replace missing water. Innovation buys time; it does not reverse trends. The Mississippi River, once symbolic of endless movement, now symbolizes constraint. By this stage, the conversation changes tone. The question is no longer whether the river will recover fully. The question becomes how much loss America can absorb before fundamental systems begin to fail. Food security, energy stability, trade dominance, each is linked to water availability more tightly than most people ever realized. The river's decline exposes the hidden architecture of modern life. And still, daily life continues. Highways remain crowded, stores remain stocked, sports play on television. This normalcy is deceptive. It masks a growing vulnerability beneath the surface, a system operating closer to its limits than at any point in modern history. Collapse does not announce itself loudly. It advances quietly, disguised as inconvenience. The Mississippi River is no longer just a natural feature on a map. It has become a stress test for the entire nation. How America responds will define not only its environmental future, but its economic and social cohesion. The river's retreat forces a reckoning with limits. limits of growth, limits of control, limits of denial. And as those limits close in, one reality becomes impossible to escape. The river is not waiting for America to decide. It is already deciding for it.
As the years pass, the Mississippi River no longer dominates national conversations the way it once did. Not because the problem is solved, but because it has been normalized. Americans adapt to instability the way humans always have, by absorbing it into daily life. Higher food prices become routine. Water restrictions become seasonal expectations. News coverage shifts elsewhere. The river's decline fades from headlines, even as its consequences deepen beneath the surface. This normalization is perhaps the most dangerous phase of all. Because when a crisis becomes background noise, urgency disappears. Emergency measures harden into permanent conditions. What was once unacceptable becomes tolerated. Entire generations grow up never knowing the Mississippi as their parents did, never seeing it full, powerful, unstoppable. To them, the reduced river is not a warning, it is simply reality. Policy begins to reflect this acceptance. Instead of restoration, strategies focus on containment. Instead of recovery, the language becomes management. Resources are allocated not to save what was lost, but to protect what remains. Some regions are quietly deprioritized. Investment flows toward zones deemed viable in a water-constrained future, while others are left to decline with minimal intervention. This is not framed as abandonment, but efficiency. The emotional cost of this shift is enormous. Communities that once thrived along the river struggle with identity loss as much as economic hardship. Festivals fade, river culture erodes. Traditions tied to water, fishing, transport, trade become symbolic rather than practical. Memory replaces function. And when culture weakens, cohesion follows. The Mississippi was not just infrastructure, it was narrative. Its decline fractures that story. Meanwhile, climate volatility continues to accelerate. Heat waves intensify evaporation. Storms grow stronger but less predictable. Floods still occur, but now they are destructive rather than nourishing. Without healthy wetlands and sediment flow, floodwaters carve damage instead of renewal. The river oscillates between too little and too much, never settling into balance. Extremes replace stability. National security planners take this instability seriously. Internal assessments increasingly link water scarcity to domestic unrest. Food price spikes correlate with political tension. Migration strains local governments. Emergency responses drain budgets already stretched thin. The idea that environmental stress can destabilize powerful nations is no longer theoretical, it is documented. Globally, other countries watch closely. What happens to the United States reshapes global expectations. If America struggles to manage water scarcity, no nation is immune. The Mississippi becomes a case study taught in universities and war colleges alike, a demonstration of how climate pressure interacts with complex economies. Influence no longer comes from dominance alone, but from demonstrated resilience. And resilience is still uncertain. Yet even here, the story does not fully darken. In pockets across the country, a different response emerges. Local cooperation replaces federal paralysis. Watersheds are managed holistically rather than politically. Indigenous water knowledge, long ignored, gains recognition. Communities experiment with regenerative agriculture, floodplain restoration, and decentralized systems. These efforts are small compared to the scale of the problem, but they matter. They prove that decline is not the same as surrender. The Mississippi itself responds in subtle ways. Nature adapts faster than policy. New channels form. Vegetation claims exposed land. Life persists, reshaped but not erased. The river no longer serves the economy the way it once did, but it continues to shape the land in ways humans cannot fully control. This quiet persistence offers both warning and hope. The final lesson of the Mississippi's decline is not about water alone. It is about interdependence. Modern America was built on the assumption that systems could be isolated, economy separate from environment, growth separate from limits, progress separate from consequence. The river disproves that assumption. When water changes, everything changes. When a foundational system weakens, every layer above it feels the strain. Standing at the edge of the reduced river, the future feels uncertain but not empty. Collapse, when it comes, is rarely the end of everything. It is the end of a specific way of living. What follows depends on whether societies learn, adapt, and cooperate, or cling to illusions that no longer hold. The Mississippi River carried America into the modern age. Its retreat forces America to decide what kind of nation it will be after abundance. And that decision, more than the river itself, will determine what happens next.